So, because the main idea for CIPE was that the political freedoms and economic freedoms are intertwined, they're linked. And for the private sector to flourish, for entrepreneurs to work effectively, they need democratic institutions, and vice versa. For democracy to sustain, they need to have strong economic institutions to deliver on the democratic promises. So all our programming is driven by the demand of the local private sector, of those local private sector communities that exist. So we do not come with the agenda or say that's the way it should be done. We are locally driven. All our programming is locally driven. And therefore, all our anti-corruption programming depends on what our local communities, local partners would like to do. And it depends on, of course, various factors. It depends on the factors to what extent corruption is widespread in the private sector. And unfortunately, in the countries where we work in Europe and Eurasia, there are countries with systemic corruption, meaning where corruption is the rule. It's not an exception. So you have to find appropriate entry points so you can start tackling this problem. We realize that corruption is a very sensitive issue. It's a political issue. And of course, we're very aware that people who are engaged on tackling corruption, they have to do it without risk for themselves. So therefore, they find those entry points that they can promote themselves locally. And identifying the people who are willing to take on the anti-corruption work, to start asking questions that have not been asked before. So this is the first step in many cases where in the countries where we work. We call it cultivating champions. We identify people who have personal, professional interest in leading this work. They take risk, but they manage this risk themselves with our support. So they come up with the idea, for example, of we need a stronger voice of the companies that want to work transparently and openly. And they can't, because the market is completely taken over by oligarchic companies. And they created, so oligarchs, sometimes they create their own small companies to bid on the public tenders. So the market is completely captured. And for those entrepreneurs and independent private sector that would like to participate in the public tenders, in works and have growth opportunities, they have no chance, because they know that they never win those public tenders. The second line of work is really bringing these people together to show them that you're not alone and you can do it. And you do it professionally, safely, openly, in communication with the government, with the civil society. And we at CIPE show how you can do it, how you can do community communication skill building, how you can do advocacy, meaning how you can transparently reach to the government, set the economic agenda, identify the priorities, not the lobbying, which is the secret, unaccountable, non-transparent, when the company only pushes for its own interest at the expense of everyone else, but advocacy, when the private sector gets together and promotes the interest of the entire industry and sector and the economy, of small entrepreneurs, for example. There is another line of work. So in addition to cultivating champions, identifying them, then helping them to get together, to get organized, to promote their reforms and ideas collectively. And also what's really helping us is that there is this global movement for greater accountability, transparency, and democratic participation. The challenges are that the private sector is divided, and we need to bring them in one space to enable communication. That not all public entities are very much interested in engaging. And so we are working with our partners on how they engage with the governments on issues of anti-corruption, transparency, and accountability. The large private sector, some of the percentages of informal sector are very high in countries, meaning that they're not even registered. They operate, but they are partly informal, partly formal. So it creates additional obstacles for the private sector to speak in one voice, to raise their concerns effectively and to find solutions. And again, corruption in many countries where we work is really systemic. So you have to find a safe entry point for where you start the discussion for private sector to express their views. But in terms of impact, we have some great success thanks to the leadership of our local partners, local business associations, local entrepreneurs, and the companies to have large. To the membership on this business association is growing. The number of companies joining the anti-corruption initiatives is growing. There is more awareness. There is more interest in learning more, in actually doing the change within their own companies. And as we know, these changes are not quick. To build a culture of integrity in the company takes years. It takes strong leadership from the business owner, from the business leader. We call it tone from the top. Without it, it's very unlikely the change will happen. So a lot of things have to happen, and support is much needed from organizations such as CIPE to support the efforts of the people in many countries around the world to take leadership, to achieve reforms that they want, and to operate honestly without being succumbed to corruption, solicitation, to bribery, and to this inhumane and really very uncomfortable, disrespectful treatment, whether by the private sector colleagues or by the public officials. So we see greater engagement in our program, greater awareness of what the issues are, why corruption is so damaging. Because when in some countries, it's not even clear what's wrong with the conflict of interest, whether it's okay. Bribery is fine, it actually facilitates the business. Well, that's changing. And the final point what's changing is that the private sector is not being perceived as a problem. It's part of the problem because private sector is always a bad guy. It's they who bribe. It's they who corrode the environment. What is changing, the private sector should not be the bad guy and is not the bad guy. It's the families, it's the parents, it's the people who want to do business honestly, transparently, and fairly, with fairness, to get what they deserve. And they take leadership, and these people build greater trust between themselves and communities, and with the public sector. And that's what we see as our greatest achievement at CIPE.